The road to war, Caesar's gamble, the breaking point. The world of ancient Rome had always been one of ambition, power struggles, and shifting alliances, but never before had the stakes been so high. By the time Julius Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River in 49 BC, he faced a decision that would determine the fate of Rome itself. Before him lay the road to Rome, behind him, a republic that had already branded him a traitor. Alia acta est. The die is cast, he supposedly said, as he stepped forward, leading his legions across the river. In that moment, the fate of Rome was sealed. This wasn't just a civil war, it was the death of the Republic and the birth of something entirely new. But how did it come to this? How did two former allies, Caesar and Pompey, become bitter enemies? And how did the ambitions of a few men plunge the greatest civilization of its time into war? To understand the inevitability of this conflict, we must go back not just to Caesar's rise, but to the very foundations of Rome's growing instability. The fall of the Roman Republic, a republic in crisis. Rome was never meant to have kings. Its system of governance was built on the rejection of monarchy, on the belief that no single man should wield absolute power. The Senate ruled, and power was shared among the elite. It was a delicate balance, one that had kept Rome strong for centuries. But by the time of Caesar, that balance was falling apart. The republic had grown too big, too powerful. The very system that had made it strong was now its greatest weakness. The Senate was filled with corrupt aristocrats, more interested in preserving their own power than in governing. Political rivalries had turned into street violence, and the people, tired of the endless conflicts, were looking for a leader who could bring order. This was the Rome that Caesar and Pompey inherited, a Rome that was already on the edge of destruction. The rise of two titans, Caesar and Pompey. If history had played out differently, Caesar and Pompey might have ruled Rome together. Pompey was the greatest general of his time, a man who had conquered the East, crushed pirates, and expanded Rome's dominion. He had power, prestige, and influence. Caesar, on the other hand, was a rising star, charismatic, brilliant, and deeply beloved by the people. His military campaigns in Gaul had made him a legend, and his ability to connect with the common soldier made him more than just another aristocrat. For a time, they worked together. Along with the wealthy Crassus, they formed the First Triumvirate, an alliance that kept the Senate in check and allowed them to dominate Roman politics. But alliances built on ambition never last. When Crassus died, the balance was broken. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now saw him as a threat. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's growing power, turned against him. And so, Rome was divided not by ideals, but by the ambitions of two men who both believed they alone should rule. The March on Rome, Caesar's daring move. In 50 BC, the Senate made its fatal mistake. It ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. They knew that without his army, he would be powerless. But Caesar had no intention of surrendering his power. Instead, he made the boldest move in Roman history. He led his 13th legion across the Rubicon, an act of war against the Senate. No Roman general was allowed to bring his army into Italy, but Caesar, knowing that hesitation meant death, did it anyway. The moment he crossed that river, Rome was at war. Pompey, caught off guard, fled the city. He had the larger army, but he needed time to gather his forces. Caesar, always the master of speed and strategy, wasted no time. He marched on Rome, seizing power without a fight. But the war was far from over. Pompey regrouped in Greece, where he built a massive army, supported by the Senate and Rome's wealthiest elites. He was certain of victory. After all, he had twice the number of soldiers as Caesar. He had cavalry, supplies, and a vast network of support. Caesar, however, had something greater: momentum. The first battles, Caesar's genius on display. Before facing Pompey directly, Caesar had to secure his western flank. His first move was to march into Spain, where Pompey's loyal legions were stationed. The campaign was swift and brutal. Caesar outmaneuvered his enemies at every turn, forcing entire armies to surrender without a single major battle. Within months, Spain was his. With the west secure, he turned his eyes eastward toward Pompey. What followed would be one of the greatest military campaigns in history, a series of battles that would culminate in the legendary showdown at Pharsalus. But first, he had to cross the sea. The stage is set. By the end of 49 BC, the lines were drawn. Rome was no longer a republic, it was a battlefield. Caesar had momentum, but Pompey had numbers, resources, and powerful allies. On paper, Pompey should have won. He had everything a general needed to crush an enemy, but as history would soon prove, Caesar was no ordinary enemy. He was about to embark on a campaign that would redefine warfare and change Rome forever. And it all led to one place: Pharsalus, the siege of Massilia and the march to Greece. The pursuit begins. By the end of 49 BCE, the war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had escalated into a full-scale conflict. Rome itself had already fallen into Caesar's hands without a fight, but the true battle for power was still ahead. Pompey, the Senate's champion, had fled to Greece, where he was gathering a massive army. Caesar could not allow him to regroup. To win this war, he needed to hunt down Pompey and defeat him before his forces became unbeatable. But Caesar's march was not without obstacles. Across the Mediterranean, loyalist strongholds, rebellious cities, and naval blockades stood in his way. His enemies hoped to stall his advance, draining his resources and forcing him into a costly war of attrition. However, if history had proven anything, it was that Caesar never played by his enemies' rules. The siege of Massilia, a city defies Caesar, a thorn in Caesar's side. One of the first challenges in Caesar's campaign was Massilia, modern-day Marseille, a wealthy and influential city allied with Pompey's forces. Despite being a Roman province, Massilia refused to surrender. Its leaders, backed by Pompey's navy, believed they could outlast Caesar's forces until reinforcements arrived. It was a strategic miscalculation. Caesar's response: divide and conquer. Rather than getting bogged down in a prolonged siege, Caesar made a brilliant decision. He delegated the battle. While he personally marched east to neutralize Pompey's legions in Spain, he left 3 legions under the command of Trebonius and Decimus Brutus to besiege Massilia. This allowed Caesar to handle multiple fronts at once, a hallmark of his strategic genius. What followed was one of the most dramatic sieges in Roman history. The siege begins. Massilia's desperate defense. The city of Massilia was heavily fortified, with massive walls and a powerful fleet. At first, it seemed like an impossible task, but Caesar's forces were not just soldiers, they were engineers. Massive siege towers were built, pushing ever closer to the city. Roman battering rams hammered at the gates, weakening the defenses. Meanwhile, Decimus Brutus led a naval assault, engaging Pompey's supporting fleet in the Mediterranean. For weeks, the battle raged on land and sea, but Massilia's defenders fought with unmatched resilience. They unleashed fire attacks, countermines, and brutal sallies against the Roman forces. Pompey's fleet attempted multiple rescues, but Brutus's navy crushed them each time. Caesar's return. The final blow. After securing Spain, Caesar returned to Massilia. By this point, the city was on the brink of collapse. The Romans had breached the outer defenses, and famine was taking hold. Seeing the inevitable, Massilia finally surrendered, but under surprising conditions. Rather than destroying the city, Caesar spared it. He punished its leaders, but allowed Massilia to remain intact, a testament to his pragmatism over cruelty. With the western front secure, Caesar now turned his full attention to Pompey. The race to Greece. Pompey's stronghold in the east. While Caesar was fighting in Spain and Gaul, Pompey had established a massive army in Greece. He was backed by senatorial legions, still loyal to the Republic, allied kings and mercenaries who feared Caesar's rise, a superior navy which could cut off Caesar's supply lines. On paper, Pompey had the upper hand. If he could force a naval battle, he could starve Caesar's forces before they even reached Greece. Caesar's gamble, a daring naval crossing. But Caesar was never one to play it safe. Rather than waiting for reinforcements, he took a desperate risk. He set sail immediately, with only half his army. It was a bold but dangerous move. If Pompey's navy caught them, Caesar's forces would be annihilated at sea. But luck favored the bold. Caesar's initial fleet made it to Greece before Pompey could react. Once there, he quickly secured key ports and supply routes. However, his army was still divided. Half his legions were stranded in Italy, waiting for transport. Pompey realized the opportunity. He blocked the sea routes, preventing Caesar's reinforcements from crossing. Mark Antony's heroic rescue. Enter Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general. Seeing that Caesar was isolated, Antony took drastic action. In a daring nighttime maneuver, he broke through Pompey's naval blockade. He successfully delivered the remaining legions, reuniting Caesar's forces. Pompey had missed his chance to destroy Caesar while he was weak. Now, the two armies stood ready for war. The Battle of Dyrrhachium, Caesar's first defeat. A near disaster for Caesar. The first major battle between Caesar and Pompey took place near Dyrrhachium, modern Albania. Pompey, using his superior numbers, built a massive fortification line, forcing Caesar into a defensive siege. For the first time, Caesar was outmaneuvered. Pompey's forces launched a surprise counterattack, breaking through Caesar's lines. Thousands of Caesar's men were slaughtered, and the army was nearly routed. Caesar was forced to retreat, suffering one of his worst defeats. Pompey's army celebrated victory. His officers urged him to chase Caesar and finish the war. But Pompey hesitated. He feared an ambush and chose to wait instead. Caesar's masterstroke, luring Pompey to Pharsalus. Instead of retreating fully, Caesar made a bold countermove. He deliberately withdrew to a location of his choosing, Pharsalus. There, he set the stage for the final confrontation, drawing Pompey into one decisive battle. And this time, he would make no mistakes. The stage is set for Pharsalus. By the summer of 48 BCE, the war had reached its climax. Caesar had survived sieges, naval blockades, and his first major defeat. Pompey, despite his superior army, had failed to crush Caesar when he had the chance. Now, the two greatest generals of their age stood face to face. The Battle of Pharsalus would decide the fate of Rome itself. The Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's genius unleashed, the defining moment of the civil war. For over a year, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had been locked in a brutal struggle for control of Rome. Pompey, once hailed as the protector of the Republic, commanded the larger army, superior cavalry, and control of the eastern provinces. He had every advantage. Yet, history does not favor the strongest, but the boldest. Caesar, with his smaller but battle-hardened legions, had outmaneuvered, outhought, and outlasted his enemies at every turn. And now, at Pharsalus, he would prove why he was Rome's greatest general. This was more than just a battle. This was the moment Rome's fate would be decided. The march to Pharsalus. The clash becomes inevitable. Pompey's miscalculation. The war of attrition. Before Pharsalus, Pompey had a clear strategy. Do not fight Caesar in an open battle. He knew Caesar's legions were far more experienced. His goal was to starve them out, cutting off supply lines until they collapsed from exhaustion. In theory, this was the correct approach, but war is not fought in theories. Caesar's desperate situation. Caesar's army was increasingly desperate. Supplies were running low, and morale was fading fast. But rather than retreat, Caesar marched straight for Pompey's camp, forcing him into a confrontation. This was Caesar's genius. When faced with a superior enemy, he dictated the battlefield on his own terms. The battlefield at Pharsalus. The armies face off. The morning of August 9, 48 BCE. Done with two of the greatest armies Rome had ever seen lined up against each other. Pompey commanded 45,000 infantry, twice Caesar's number, 7,000 cavalry, mostly from the east, including skilled Parthian archers. The best strategic position, with access to supplies. Caesar had 22,000 legionaries, hardened veterans from Gaul and Spain. Only 1,000 cavalry, a huge disadvantage against Pompey's superior horsemen, soldiers who were starving, exhausted, and outnumbered. But Pompey made one fatal mistake. He underestimated Caesar's tactical genius. Pompey's overconfidence. The flawed plan. Pompey's plan was simple. Use his superior cavalry to outflank Caesar's forces. Overwhelm Caesar's right flank, breaking his army. Once the flank collapsed, the entire army would be surrounded and destroyed. On paper, it was perfect. The war is never fought on paper. Caesar's hidden strategy. The unexpected counterattack. The secret fourth line. Caesar knew Pompey would rely on his cavalry advantage, so he prepared an ambush. He ordered his troops to form a hidden fourth line behind his right flank. These were hand-picked legionaries, trained specifically to counter cavalry attacks. They were given one mission: hold the line at all costs. The trap is set. As the battle began, Pompey's cavalry charged Caesar's right flank, expecting an easy victory. But instead of retreating, Caesar's hidden fourth line emerged. Armed with pilum-heavy javelins, the Roman soldiers threw their weapons directly at the charging cavalry's faces. Horses panicked, throwing riders into chaos. Close combat broke out, and Pompey's cavalry, trained for speed, not melee combat, was shattered. Pompey's entire strategy collapsed in an instant. The turning point. Caesar goes on the offensive. With Pompey's cavalry routed, Caesar gave the order to advance. His legions surged forward, pressing Pompey's army into a tight, chaotic mass. Pompey, seeing the battle unravel, panicked. Instead of rallying his troops, he fled the battlefield, abandoning his army to their fate. The once mighty Pompeian army collapsed, Soldiers threw down their weapons, begging for mercy. By mid-afternoon, the battle was over. Caesar had won. Pompey's fate. The end of an era. Pompey's escape and assassination. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary, but the Egyptian pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, saw Pompey as a liability. On September 28, 48 BCE, as Pompey stepped onto Egyptian soil, he was stabbed to death by his own allies. His severed head was sent to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, upon seeing his greatest rival's head, wept. He had wanted to defeat Pompey in battle, not see him butchered like a common criminal. In that moment, the civil war was over, but Caesar's rise was just beginning. Conclusion. The legacy of Pharsalus. Pharsalus was not just a victory, it was a turning point in history. Caesar had proven his genius, defeating overwhelming odds through sheer strategy. The Republic was dead from here on. Rome belonged to Caesar alone. The world was about to enter a new era, an empire ruled by one man. But with victory came new enemies, new betrayals, and the final steps toward Caesar's tragic fate. The rise of Caesar as Rome's sole ruler. The dawn of a new Rome. The Battle of Pharsalus had shattered the last real resistance against Julius Caesar. Pompey, once the Republic's greatest general, lay dead in Egypt, betrayed by his own allies. The Senate's authority had crumbled, its members either fled or submitted to Caesar's mercy. The civil war was not yet over, but Rome's fate had already been sealed. With his enemies defeated, Caesar now faced his greatest challenge, not winning a war, but building a new Rome. This was no longer about restoring the Republic. It was about creating an empire. Caesar in Egypt. Love and war. The Egyptian crisis. Ptolemy XIII versus Cleopatra. Upon arriving in Alexandria, Caesar was furious to see Pompey's severed head presented to him as a gift. But Egypt was in chaos. The young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, was locked in a power struggle with his sister, Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra, brilliant and ambitious, saw Caesar as her key to power. One night, she had herself smuggled into his palace, rolled inside a carpet. When Caesar unrolled it, he found the most intelligent and seductive woman of the ancient world staring back at him. Caesar, always drawn to strong, strategic minds, became entangled in Cleopatra's struggle. The siege of Alexandria, a test of Caesar's strength. Ptolemy XIII, furious at Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar, attacked. Caesar and his small force of 4,000 men were trapped inside the palace. For months, they held out against Egypt's much larger army, relying on naval reinforcements. In the end, Caesar crushed Ptolemy's forces, and the young pharaoh drowned in the Nile while fleeing. With Cleopatra now firmly in power, Caesar and the Egyptian queen became lovers. 9 months later, Cleopatra gave birth to Ptolemy XV Caesarion, whom she claimed was Caesar's son. The final campaigns, mopping up resistance. Although Pharsalus had been decisive, pockets of resistance remained. The African Campaign 46 BC. The last stand of the Optimates. In Africa, Pompey's surviving supporters, including Cato the Younger, rallied to make one last stand. Caesar crossed the Mediterranean, leading his legions into another brutal war. At the Battle of Thapsus, Caesar's forces crushed the enemy, marking the end of the senatorial resistance. Rather than surrender, Cato chose to commit suicide, refusing to live under Caesar's rule. The Spanish Campaign 45 BC. The sons of Pompey, Pompey's two sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, led one final rebellion in Spain. Caesar personally led his forces, defeating them at the Battle of Munda. With Gnaeus killed and Sextus fleeing, the last remnants of a Republican army were gone. At long last, Julius Caesar was the undisputed master of Rome. Caesar's return to Rome. Dictator for life. The triumph of Caesar 46 BC. Caesar returned to Rome in triumph, celebrating for massive victory parades. Gaul, his conquest of the barbarian lands. Egypt, his victory over Ptolemy XIII. Africa, his defeat of Cato and the Senate's last resistance. Spain, his victory over Pompey's sons. The Roman people worshipped him. He was their hero, their savior. But for Rome's old elite, he was becoming something far more dangerous. Caesar's reforms. Rebuilding Rome. Rather than seeking revenge, Caesar pardoned many of his former enemies. He reorganized the Senate, filling it with loyal supporters. He granted citizenship to people across the empire. He fixed Rome's economy, improving debt relief, infrastructure, and land distribution. The one title changed everything: dictator for life. It was unprecedented. No one in Rome's history had held absolute power without a time limit. To his supporters, Caesar was a visionary leader. To his enemies, he was a king in all but name. And Rome had a deep hatred for kings. The Ides of March, the assassination of Caesar, the growing conspiracy. As Caesar's power grew, so did his enemies. A group of senators, led by Brutus, Cassius, and other former allies, began plotting. They feared Caesar would declare himself king. They believed they were saving Rome from tyranny. But in reality, they were blinded by old republican ideals, unable to see that the republic was already dead. On March 1544 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the theater of Pompey, unaware that history was about to change forever. The murder of a god. As Caesar entered the Senate chamber, the conspirators surrounded him. The first dagger struck his shoulder. A second plunged into his ribs. More followed stab after stab, until his white toga was drenched in blood. When he saw Brutus, his once trusted friend, among them, he uttered the legendary words, "Et tu, Brute, even you, Brutus." With those words, the greatest leader Rome had ever known fell to the ground, lifeless. Caesar was dead. The aftermath. The rise of the Roman Empire. The assassin's fatal miscalculation. The conspirators believed they had saved Rome. Instead, they had doomed it. Instead of restoring the Republic, the power vacuum led to chaos. Caesar's allies, Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, vowed revenge. The civil wars resumed, deadlier than ever before. In the end, the Republic was destroyed not by Caesar, but by those who killed him. And in its place, a new empire would rise. Caesar's legacy lives on. Caesar did not live to see the empire he had built, but his legacy shaped Rome for centuries. His adopted son, Octavian, would later become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The name Caesar would become a title for rulers from Roman emperors to Russian czars. The world would never see another like him. Julius Caesar was more than a man. He was a force of history, unstoppable, legendary, eternal.